How to get high-resolution landscape photos using pixel shifting or super resolution, even if you have a low-resolution camera. Matt with B&H here, and in this video, we're going to talk about how you can use pixel shifting and that super resolution feature to get some incredibly high megapixel photos. We'll talk about the gear that I'm using to capture these landscape shots, the settings that I'm using for these photos as well, and then we'll talk about some of the best practices for your super resolution photos. Finally, we'll head to post-processing where I'll show you how to actually merge these photos for those high megapixel results. So what exactly is pixel shifting and super resolution? They're very similar. Pixel shifting, however, is how your camera's sensor moves around to capture those multiple images. And super resolution is the same thing, but without the pixel shifting feature of a camera doing it itself. You're left with having to do it handheld. So for my gear, I'm comparing 3 different camera setups. The Sony a7R5, which is a whopping 61 megapixels already, the Sony a7S III, which is 12 megapixels, and the Sony a6700, which is an APS-C camera and 26 megapixels. So for my lenses, I'm using Tamron's suite of high-resolution lenses, including the Tamron 35-150mm, the 50-400mm, the 11-20mm, and the 17-50mm. Let's talk about some of the pros and cons of using super resolution, starting with the pros. There will be a noticeable difference and improvement in the detail in that final result image, and also less noise and grain, which is why you'll see many astrophotographers actually stacking multiple photos to get a very low noise result. And another major advantage of super resolution is that you can actually go back into your old catalog of photos and see if you have any burst photos that you took in the past, maybe at a lower resolution camera, and see if you can align those and merge those in post-processing for a super resolution result. There are a couple of downsides to super resolution that are worth considering. Starting with number 1, you're going to take a lot of photos, and that's going to require storing those photos. So that's a significant increase in the amount of space that these photos are going to take up. And number 2, you can't photograph moving subjects using super resolution. So that's not so much of an issue with landscape photos, but if we are photographing wildlife, it would definitely pose some problems. And the reason being is that merging multiple photos, and we need those photos to align and stack perfectly for post-processing software. Let's jump into how to go about taking these super resolution photos, starting with pixel shifting on the Sony a7R5 and similar cameras as well. So how many photos should you take for your super resolution shot? I'd recommend at least 4. You could go higher than that, but at a certain point, it's definitely reaching diminishing returns. Not to mention the fact that it's going to add more strain on your computer in post-processing and take up a significant amount of storage space. So for our camera settings, first things first, definitely want to make sure that you're shooting in RAW so that you're getting all of the dynamic range and information out of your camera sensor in the first place. When it comes to our exposure triangle, you want to shoot at the sharpest point of your lens, which tends to be around f8 to f11. This can be a little bit more challenging in low light scenarios, but I would say as a general rule of thumb, f8 to f11 is the best bet. Our ISO is going to depend on our shutter speed and our aperture, of course, but as a general rule of thumb, aiming for as low as possible is always going to give the best results. So I've got my Sony a7R5 here mixed with the 35-150mm from Tamron. And this camera has pixel shifting actually built into it. It has 2 different options. It'll take either 4 or 16 images back to back at its shortest interval. And that's really great because it will reduce any unwanted movement inside of your scene, and also it'll give you those images individually so that you can choose what you want to do with them in post. So I'm going to jump into the menu and turn on pixel shifting, which is in the drive mode function. I'll come down to the shortest interval, and I'm also choosing 16 images for this stack because I'm feeling a little adventurous. I feel bad for my CPU later. And then from there, I'm also going to turn on a 2-second delay to remove any unwanted shake when I hit the shutter button. And also, I like to actually use manual focus and then a focus magnifier onto my scene to make sure that it's absolutely tack sharp. And I use manual focus because I want to make sure that all of the photos in the stack have the same focus. So once I hit the shutter button, it'll wait 2 seconds and take 16 images by shifting the sensor around inside of the camera. I could go have some margaritas. The main advantage of this version of pixel shifting is that the camera knows exactly how it's moving the sensor around, so it's a little bit easier for the Sony software and even Photoshop to align those photos in post-processing and eventually stack them as well. Some camera brands with a pixel shifting feature built into them let you actually do so handheld, but I would still recommend using a tripod because you'll get better results at the end of the day. And also, it allows the option to actually use a slower shutter speed, which you wouldn't be able to do while shooting a handheld. For our cameras that don't have pixel shifting features built into them, like my A6700 and the A7S III, we can still use super resolution by photographing them handheld. In fact, we have to use handheld because if we put it on a tripod, the sensor would not move and it would get the same readout every single time. But when shooting handheld, we get a little bit of hand movement, just enough to move the sensor around and get a different readout each time. Alright, so now I've switched to the Sony A7S III paired with the Tamron 17 to 50mm. And this camera does not have pixel shifting built in, and it's a 12 megapixel sensor, so I think it's really going to benefit from this super resolution photo. For my settings, I'm shooting at high burst, high plus at that, and I'm using a fixed white balance because you don't want that shifting throughout your stack. Let's see what we can get. And you want to make sure for this you're being as still as possible. I'm pretty stoked about that. For your shutter speed, I would aim for at least double your focal length. So if I'm shooting on a 50mm, then I want to aim for at least 1/100th of a second. And that's going to help reduce any unwanted blur in the subjects in frame, and also any unwanted blur from our handheld movements. Now that we've successfully taken our super resolution photos in the field, it's time for the post-processing portion. And for this video, I'm using Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom, and I'll also show you how to combine those pixel shift images in the Sony software as well. So jumping right into it, I've already imported my photos from my R5, S3, and A6700. And I don't plan to show how I actually do that with each camera, but I will show the results and compare them at the end. And I've selected 5 photos of this one composition that we photographed earlier today. Just a beautiful shot of the road and the fall foliage surrounding it. So first things first, before you do any of your merging and stacking, you want to actually apply your exposure adjustments and really any other adjustments that affect dynamic range as well. And the reason being is because we have our raw images now, we want to make sure that we make those changes before they're converted into a TIFF or whatever you end up converting them to in Photoshop. So right off the bat, I already made some adjustments to this image by bringing up the shadows because they were looking a little dark because of how much contrast the trees were bringing in, and I brought down the highlights a bit as well. Other than that, I haven't applied much of anything. It's also very important before you go into Photoshop or your stacking software, you want to delete any blurry photos that you accidentally took or out of focus photos, because that is going to mess up the alignment and definitely mess up your final result. So I have this one photo here that is a little chaotic. I was hand holding it and kind of running a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this one. And from there, I'm just going to go ahead and select my 5 images. And then I'll right click, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. I also want to point out that we were being extra cautious in this road photo. There were really no cars coming throughout the entire day, surprisingly, and I had 2 spotters. So just so everyone knows, we were being extra safe for this photo. All right, so I've got my layers here in Photoshop, and the first thing I'm going to want to do is we are going to upscale this image by 200%. So I'm going to go to image, image size, and I changed the width and height criteria here to percent, and then I'm going to go 200. You can go up to 400. It really is proportional to the amount of photos that you took as well. And for your resample, I like to go with Preserve Details 2.0. It does add a little bit of sharpness to the photos as well. And if you find that your final result is getting too sharp, then you can go with the nearest neighbor hard edges option instead. So we're gonna click OK, let that process. And of course, all of this, it depends on how many photos you're stacking. If you have a lot more, then it's going to process a little more for each step. All right, so now we have our layers in Photoshop. Also, I just want to point out, this is a very, like it's impressive just how sharp these images are out of that Tamron lens and mixed with the Sony camera. It already is a very impressive image, but of course, if we wanted to print this at a larger size, or we wanted to, I don't know, if we want to throw this on a billboard, I would love that. Then we're going to need a higher megapixel count. So that's really the point of making these super resolution photos as well. So from here, I have all my layers selected, and I'm gonna go to Edit, Align Layers, Auto Align Layers. And you wanna have Auto selected for the projection, and for both lens correction settings, these should be checked off. And then I'm gonna click OK, and then let Photoshop align these layers automatically. So after it aligns, you might notice a little white edge around your photo. We can always crop this later. But from there, we're gonna go ahead and stack our photos, and we're gonna use the opacity of each layer to achieve this. So you're gonna wanna use a little bit of math here. We got 1/1 is going to be our bottom layer, and then you go layer by layer, 1 over whichever number layer it is. So bottom to top, starting on the bottom here, we got 1/1, that is 100%. 1/2, we're gonna go to 50%. 1/3, we're gonna go to 33%. 1/4, we're gonna go to 25%. And 1/5, we're gonna go to 20%. And you could just double check that everything aligns well just by going down the order and making sure that you don't see any dramatic shifts when you turn off the layer, and everything looks good there. Now that we have all of this detail in one image, we got a massive file here, and a lot of detail means that we actually have to add a little bit of sharpening. Now this is kind of up to you if you don't want to sharpen your image at all, but I think that it helps to make those details actually stand out because there is so much data in this one image. Adding a little bit of Smart Sharpen actually helps to bring all of that data out. So I go to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen, and I set the radius to around 1 to 2 pixels, somewhere in that range. And then for the amount, I aim for around 200 to 600, and you could use the preview to decide which would work best for your image. But somewhere between 200 and 300% tends to be the sweet spot. I'm gonna click OK. Then I'll save it, send it back to Lightroom, do any final edits, and then I'm left with a massive file. And this is the final before and after from our original image to our final super resolution result. So I've got one more result, and this is with the Sony a7R5. So this is a 61 megapixel camera, and I took 16 images. So this is gonna leave us with a 240 megapixel result. Absolutely mind-blowing. Let's take a look in the imaging software from Sony to see how to combine them. So we're gonna open Sony Viewer, and you can see once you navigate to the folder where your stacks are, it actually lets you know which files are part of your pixel shift. And there's a little parentheses next to the file names, 1 through 16. So I'm gonna go ahead and highlight all of those photos, right-click, create Pixel Shift Multi-Shoot Composite. And I'm gonna turn Stabilize Composite Image on in case there are any motion in the trees. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and export this image. And this is the final results from before and after with that 240 megapixel final photo from Sony a7R5. I've got one more stack for you from the a7S III. I'm gonna do the same exact process. This is a 12 megapixel camera, so we're gonna stack 4 photos together for a total result of 48 megapixels. And here's the final result from the Sony a7S III. Thank you all so much for watching. We had a ton of fun filming this video. If you enjoyed the results, or if you have any questions, let us know in the comments down below. And also let us know in the comments where you plan to photograph super resolution landscapes. We would love to hear it. I'll see you guys next time.
How to get higher resolution photos?
Who are you imitating?
Bane.
Oh, I thought that was Cher. Right.